In a lot of ways, SpongeBob SquarePants' Battle for Bikini Bottom is an enigma. At the height of the 6th generation console's popularity, licensed games were published by the shovel load in an attempt to cash in on a franchise's popularity. And for these types of games, quality assurance was pretty sparse. For as much as I love it, the GameCube was home to some of the most pathetic, laughable, and downright appalling excuses for video games out there. Gaming was the Wild West back then. Everybody was looking to make money, and very few actually wanted to give anything in return. Heavy Iron Studios didn't have much to lose in all this. They made only 2 perfectly average games before this, and it's not like SpongeBob was famous for making good video games himself at the time. There would be no betrayal if Battle for Bikini Bottom was just another bad license game. But instead of blending in and vanishing amidst the mediocrity, it came out a hero. I'm going to be blunt when I say that Battle for Bikini Bottom is my favorite SpongeBob game, my favorite licensed game, and is a strong contender for my favorite game of all time. Yeah, I know, pretty big praise for a kid's game about the little yellow cartoon sponge who lives in a pineapple under the sea, but I wouldn't be opening this video the way I did if I didn't have total confidence in the game. Simply put, it's a masterclass 3D platformer whose whole is worth far more than some of its parts. So if you're ready, let's dive into a retrospective of Battle for Bikini Bottom. To help illustrate Battle's quality, I think we should quickly gloss over Flying Dutchman because we're going to be drawing some comparisons over the course of this video. Revenge of the Flying Dutchman was a 3D platformer collectathon that's greatest weakness came down to how late it was released. This game was behind the times both visually and mechanically for 2002, as it felt more like an N64 game. It played well enough and had some interesting ideas, but it lacked any kind of autosave, had a few problems that harmed and even mutilated the process of 100% completion, and had a costume mechanic that didn't even try to promote balance that also mostly determined the music track you would be listening to, which could destroy the atmosphere at times. Besides that, the actual connection with the SpongeBob brand was pretty 50-50. The music tracks were suitably spongy, but have that aforementioned tone problem. The writing was all over the place, but at least all of the in-game characters had their original voice actors. The graphics were primitive and had some fugly character models, but had a nice color palette and some faithfully recreated locations. I had no nostalgia, good or bad, going into it, and while I didn't buy into the hate this game's gathered over the years, I can see why it's remembered as poorly as it is. With this in mind, we can see how Battle improves both as a game and as embodiment of the SpongeBob brand. Starting with, of course, the title screen. SpongeBob theme, and the champion of Nick himself waiting for the call to action, showing off his dozen or so idle animations in the process. Off to a good start. So the story is something else. Plankton is planning on stealing the Krabby Patty formula once more, this time by creating the Duplicatotron 3000, a machine capable of mass-producing an unstoppable robot army. However, in a moment that would make Dr. Doofenshmirtz's invention design look intelligent, he accidentally sets the machine to don't obey. The robots turn on him, throw him out of the chum bucket, and set out to destroy Bikini Bottom. This leaves SpongeBob, Patrick, and Sandy to defend off the mechanical menace. It's basic and cliched, but it actually works to this game's advantage. Think about it. The best episodes of SpongeBob have similar paper-thin plot lines, and yet are among some of the most memorable segments in all of television. Chocolate with Nuts. SpongeBob and Patrick try to sell chocolate bars. Pizza delivery. SpongeBob and Squidward try to deliver a pizza. Band Geeks. Squidward gets the town together to form a marching band. Sailor Mouth. SpongeBob and Patrick discover curse words. Fun. SpongeBob attempts to befriend Plankton. All of these examples and so many other good episodes of SpongeBob have a plot synopsis you could easily give in 10 words or less, but that simple plot makes plenty of room for the humor to stretch out and just smack you around a little bit. And that perfectly explains how Battle's story is executed. This game's relationship with charm and comedy is almost tangible.
Did I say big trouble? I meant so enormous that it's hard to comprehend trouble. We'll keep you posted as this tragic story unfolds. Tragically, we're sure.
This script is absolutely ripe with fun character interactions, direct references to the show, and just a lot of really funny jokes and one-liners.
Well, then will you vaporize me?
I might spare your life so I can force you to work in my sweatshop making low-quality design and knockoff wallets.
Oh, thank you!
I'm not going to pretend every joke here lands, but for every one miss, there's another 3 that hit bullseye. I also appreciate how many major and minor characters are utilized here. Besides the cast that did appear in Flying Dutchman, we've got Mermaid Man, Barnacle Boy, Mrs. Puff, and even Bubble Buddy. Even the returning cast sees improvements, because here they're either all playable, or important NPCs that you consistently interact with and receive tasks from. Whereas in Flying Dutchman, most of the group was stolen away halfway through the game. And the ones who weren't were Plankton, who was barely utilized, Larry, who acted like the biggest chat imaginable, and the Dutchman Dutchman himself, all of them having a much better presence in this game. Plankton probably sees the greatest improvement, going from a minor antagonist in Flying Dutchman that didn't add much to an ally that works for the others purely out of necessity. He just wants to reclaim control over the robots, and his attempts to be helpful and supportive actually cause him physical pain. More importantly, he gets a lot more screen time and ends up one of the funniest characters of the bunch, which I'm very happy with.
Maybe this day won't be mine. Or the next. Or possibly even the next. Or 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 the next after that. But the one after the next. After the next. After the next. After that. Well, that one after that. Right next to that one. That will be my day!
I also like how the Dutchman is much more in character this time around than the last game. Don't get me wrong, the Flying Dutchman is a bad guy and has been a straightforward antagonist in the past, but more often than not he's portrayed as more of a neutral evil. Someone who's conniving, ruthless, and scary, but capable of showing restraint and is willing to give credit where it's due. And that describes him in this game perfectly.
Never make a deal with a ghost. Deals don't mean anything to me, except for that great deal I got on a butter churn back in 1873.
Of course, I couldn't bring up the characters utilized without bringing up the voice talents brought in. Much like the last game, almost every character here is reprised by the original actor or actress. Even the French narrator is back to being voiced by Tom Kenny, which is just fantastic.
Welcome to the dark depths of Rock Bottom, home of strange creatures and souvenir t-shirts.
Everyone is clearly giving their full efforts, and that goes a long way in selling the comedy. That said, there are two characters that aren't voiced by their original talent, which any seasoned SpongeBob fan could determine after only a couple of lines from each. Mr. Krabs and Mermaid Man, who are both voiced by the same guy, Joe White. And I don't want to sound like a dick, I mean clearly he is trying, but in this game Mr. Krabs can never break out of his chain-smoking habits, while Mermaid Man is only capable of sounding old and senile, even for his most iconic lines.
Ahoy there, SpongeBob! Swab the poop deck! Arr, 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 arr.
To the doctor's office! Away!
It's not a huge deal, seeing as they're decent enough impressions, but it's probably the biggest issue I have with the story, which is a good sign of just how well off it is to begin with. Battle for Bikini Bottom's plot, writing, and performances feel like they're ripped straight out of an episode of the cartoon, and I couldn't be any more grateful for that. Moving on, we can discuss the graphics. Now, on a technical level, only technically I stress, I'll be the first to admit that Battle isn't that great and was still comfortably outpaced by most first-party releases at the time. The environments can look pretty blocky and the textures can look pretty fuzzy from time to time. The levels aren't walled off like they were in Dutchman, which is nice since it's more accurate to how these locations look in the show, but it also means that there's a lot of empty space here that tries to fill itself up with ugly, low-poly rock formations, patches of grass, and other poorly detailed structures. Besides that, while this game does translate the SpongeBob characters into 3D far better than Dutchman did, it's obvious that not everyone made the jump as clearly as they should have. In particular, Mr. Krabs doesn't look too much better than his Dutchman days, and Barnacle Boy's model looks really weird when you realize his eyelids only appear when he blinks. This was released the same year as Mario Kart Double Dash, Jak 2, Ratchet & Clank Going Commando, and Sonic Heroes. Again, it's not the fairest comparison, but it still proves my point that Battle could have looked far better for the time. With that said, the graphics have aged about as well as they could have, due in no small part to its aesthetics. SpongeBob has always had a timeless art style, and that mostly carries over into this game. The environments are bright and colorful, with only one exception we'll get into. The character models employ most of what made the original character design so appealing, most notably the main trio, and the cutscene animation manages to be a lot more dynamic and expressive than anything that Dutchman coughed up. Where Battle probably shines the brightest is with attention to detail. Every location truly feels brought to life in this game, with plenty of episode references and fun details to go around. Most of the levels are filled with these random Bikini Bottomites. Mind you, they serve no functional purpose, they're just hanging out trying to survive the robo-apocalypse. But if that wasn't enough, of the dozen or so fish models, each one has their own panic animation when robots are nearby, celebration animation when you wreck a nearby robot, a unique animation when you attack them yourself, and will even change their appearance depending on the level, such as wearing winter clothing in Sand Mountain, or having weird biology changes in their tongue sticking out in Rock Bottom. Each of the main trio also have a decent number of island animations, along with unique animations for collecting golden spatulas, dying, drowning, traveling out of bounds, standing or traveling on slippery surfaces, sliding, and much more. My personal favorite is when a character will cower in fear while in the middle of a fight, but will act very confident after they've killed a robot for a few seconds. It's a small detail, but it adds quite a bit of catharsis in character once you realize it. The locations themselves are recreated so well. One look at any level in this game and you can immediately guess what it is, which you really couldn't say about Dutchman when the entirety of downtown looked like a dark alleyway and Goo Lagoon looked more like a desert. That said, Heavy Iron wasn't afraid to add new landmarks if the level called for it, but any new additions here feel completely natural. Rock Bottom's Museum, the Graveyard Shipwreck Cove, and Goo Blue Lagoon's carnival on the boardwalk are just a couple of examples of areas that don't really have any bases in the show, yet fit perfectly in the SpongeBob universe. That's not even getting to specific episode references like Rock Bottom's Candy Machine and the Mermalayer's Invisible Boatmobile. I also want to spotlight one of my favorite things about this game, the enemy roster. Again, no bases in the cartoon. The Planktrons, as they've been affectionately dubbed, keep in line with the show's whimsical charm and appeal despite being completely original. Their designs find the perfect balance between goofy buffoonery and off-putting intimidation that works wonders. Some of the standout enemies in my mind include Deli Delinquent Hammer, Greasy Bastard Slick, Totem of Terror Tubelets, Rootin' Tootin' Narf, and Condiment Cutthroat Tartar. Most of these baddies get their own introduction as well, which typically involves some chuckle-worthy slapstick, which I can never say no to. What's more are these enemy logs found at the robot scanner in the police department, which serve no practical purpose but provide funny flavor text for each individual undersea badnik. That's silly and nonsensical, but easily one of the funniest things in the game. Bottom line, while the technical side of Battle's presentation is lacking a little polish, it more than makes up for this with a timeless visual style and a solid mixture of faithful recreation and new elements that never clash against the SpongeBob world. That's allowed it to age gracefully with plenty of fan service thrown in for good measure. If you only needed one aspect of this game to prove it's superior to the Flying Dutchman, then look no further than the soundtrack. Now every level, each major boss, and a few contextual spots have their own track. Thank God. I know that sounds really standard practice, and it is, but I can't stress enough how much this simple change alters the overall game experience. The music in Jellyfish Fields is great, and it fits that specific location, great, but it's never used outside the area because it wouldn't fit any other location well and would grate on the player after a while. We don't need to listen to that track for the absolute majority of the game. End of story. Even on its own merits, the soundtrack is honestly fantastic and one of the game's greatest strengths. The compositions themselves are exceptional, and each track fits the respective levels so well that it could pass for background music used in the actual show. I'm also impressed by how well they nail the variety. For SpongeBob, gentle yet jovial slide guitars, ukuleles, and percussion is nothing new and is fairly common, but then we've got energized rock and roll, beautiful ambience, sinister sounding melodies, and what I can only describe as an ode to superhero themes in the 60s. Favorite tracks from me include Jellyfish Fields, Dutchman's Graveyard, the slide theme, each of the area boss themes, and especially Kelp Forest. Easily one of my favorite music pieces in any game. Let's have a listen. It's just a memorable, well-rounded OST from start to finish, and gets my vote for the best soundtrack in a SpongeBob game. So let's get into the gameplay proper, and already Battle comes out swinging. Pressing the pause button takes us to a very similar looking to-do list system. You can scroll between each level, and it counts for each level's golden spatulas and lost socks, along with the HUD that counts your current health, shiny object total, lost sock total, and unique collectibles for the level you're in. It's a lot like Dutchman's pause menu, but there are a few new changes and additions worth mentioning. Now, golden spatulas will be blacked out until you get within close proximity of the spatula or receive a task from an NPC, at which point you can check the pause screen to not only get a name of that golden spatula that usually doubles as a hint, but now you're able to warp to the location that spatula is found in at any time from anywhere. A more subtle enhancement is that you have to do most of that exploration yourself. I had no issue with Dutchman just flat out giving me the objectives to complete from the start because it meant there was no chance of getting confused about getting letter tiles, but one could make the argument that this made the game too easy since you knew exactly what to do and what to look out for. But God, can I just congratulate how brilliant and forward-thinking the developers were for this warp feature? In an open-world platformer like this, where you'll likely need to be doing quite a bit of backtracking and double-checking for completion, a warp system single-handedly negates any issues I could have with this. Honestly, it's just really good, and it's crazy to think that this was the first 3D platformer to my knowledge to implement full-on fast travel, something that could have done so much for games like Donkey Kong 64 and Banjo-Tooie. I'm not sure if I would call it the best thing about this game, but it's certainly the best innovation it has to offer. I'll also quickly mention that this game actually autosaves for golden spatulas and has no risk of random crashes. glitches. I shouldn't have to bring this up, but as you know, simply keeping up with the times is a massive improvement considering the predecessor. Speaking of massive improvements from the last time, we can move on to the controls. Dutchman had you switch between 4 different costumes with changing tents, with the costumes ranging from obsolete to completely situational to the de facto way to play the game. By contrast, Battle has you play as 3 separate characters, each with their own unique movesets that allows each one to stand out, but never overshadow the other. All 3 can jump and double jump, which are nice and floaty along with a basic attack and the ability to grab ledges. Pretty standard stuff so far, but things get much better from here. Spongebob is the only character that's playable in every level and boss fight, and fittingly, his moveset is the most fleshed out. You start with only the bubble spin, bash, and stomp, which do allow you to attack from every angle, but later on you can unlock the bubble bowl and the cruise bubble, which are both excellent ranged attacks that avoid the trap of one overshadowing the other. Sure, the cruise bubble is this crazy powerful missile that you can pilot to hit foes you either can't reach or don't want to deal with up close, but it also leaves you completely vulnerable while controlling the attack and is practically useless during enemy rushes. The bubble bowl, by contrast, is this straightforward ground projectile that's much more reliable on the fly. They're both really useful and I couldn't imagine the game without them. Spongebob is also the only one of the 3 who can tiptoe and wall jump, but don't get too excited about that. It's restricted to specially marked walls, but it still gets plenty of use. My one gripe with Spongebob, and my only real problem with the controls, is the Spongeball power-up. It's very hard to control in any segment that isn't a straight line, because his momentum is hard to reel back in once you get going. That would be fine if you could just take it slow, but almost every use case for Spongebob requires you to race to the end of an area in a very strict time limit. I'd be more angry about this, but the thing is that Spongebob was only used for a handful of brief segments and only 3 levels, so it could have been much worse. Patrick is used for 4 levels in the Robot Sandy boss fight, and has a moveset built around combat and puzzle solving. Besides his belly bump, he can perform a ground pound that creates a fairly sizable shockwave that will stun large robots and outright destroy the small fries. His most useful ability, however, is picking up and throwing tikis, stunned robots, watermelons, and ice blocks. There are some good puzzles involving this move, such as stacking up watermelons or tikis to climb up a high ledge, freezing large bodies of water to access out-of-reach goodies, and so on. I'm also a pretty big fan of throwing these exploding tikis at clusters of enemies. It's just really satisfying to wipe out a bunch of robots in one beautiful move. To be honest though, Patrick is probably my least favorite of the trio, not for any faults of his own playstyle. I just tend to favor characters and platformers with superior mobility. And that's why Sandy's my favorite of the trio, because she's the dedicated platformer character. Sure, she can bust out chops, kicks, and even her trusty lasso, which does have a sizable windup, but also allows her to hog-tie any large robot enemy for a one-hit kill, but her aerial mobility is the big selling point here. Sandy's lasso glide and ability to swing off these Texas icons are fun to use, they're constantly utilized, and they only get better the more the game demands of you. I've nothing more to say, she's just a great time all around. You change between these characters using these bust outs, which are placed appropriately and are a not so subtle hint that you'll need to switch out for the next section. It's about what I expected and there's nothing really wrong with it, so kudos for that. I should also bring up the camera, which has made some leaps and bounds compared to last time. Battle offers complete analog rotation of the camera and is flawless as far as horizontal panning goes. The camera never gets stuck on anything. If you've got your back to a wall and turn the camera a full 360 degrees, the camera will actually zoom in as it moves behind you and will zoom back out as it comes around. This is done so smoothly, with no issues whatsoever, regardless of terrain, and it deserves a lot of credit for nailing something that was still really hard to get right. The one catch is that the camera's vertical panning is too sensitive and will constantly snap back into its default position. It's not a serious problem considering how infrequently you'll be looking up or down like this, but this issue really shouldn't be here in the first place if the camera is going to exceed expectations in every other sense. Maybe it was just an oversight, I don't know. Still, way better than Dutchman's camera ripped straight up in an N64 game. Moving on to the actual gameplay, I feel inclined to tackle the 3 main pillars of Battle for Bikini Bottom's gameplay, much like I did with Flying Dutchman before getting into the levels themselves for the sake of comparison. So platforming, combat, and collecting. Despite the occasional lack of a drop shadow, the lack of depth perception in the apartment complex, and the inability to grab ledges, platforming was still pretty fun in Dutchman and was arguably the game's strongest element. However, the sheer ease and mastery of Spongebob's moveset and the scarcity of truly challenging platforming segments really kneecapped its potential. You can only perform the high jump glide combo so many times before it becomes as unremarkable and unsatisfying as a basic jump. Unfortunately, Battle doesn't offer that much more in complexity. Each character's double jump will do most of the work, and the most you can do after that is a bubble spin with Spongebob to slightly extend your jump, kind of like doing a mid-air spin in the new Super Mario Bros. Games, or glide with Sandy. Unless, of course, you're a speedrunner, where people invented a technique called cruise boosting, where activating the bubble bowl and cruise bubble on the same frame will cause Spongebob to run crazy fast and jump extremely high. It's so ridiculous to watch a game you're so used to playing a certain way get broken in half by people where they get 100% completion in 2 hours or less. That said, for as impressive as it is, I don't feel like that's a sufficient defense considering that this was never intentional. For someone who plays games strictly casually, this game's movement is nowhere near as robust and open to experimentation as, say, the 3D Mario games, and that's a real shame. Thankfully, the platforming delivers everywhere else. No janky issues or bugs that threaten the enjoyment of fun platforming sequences, and platforming that feels much more defined as far as difficulty and variation is concerned. Battle has a steady difficulty curve that starts beginner-friendly and reaches its peak when you're in the final third, which has missions like Squidward's Dream and the wall-jumping gauntlet and the Flying Dutchman's Graveyard, which are ass-kickers but also really fun challenges. The game is also perfectly fine with mixing up its obstacles to help keep the platforming interesting, even if it's not necessarily hard. Such examples include the rising water in Goo Lagoon, disco floors in the Mermalair, the trash platforms in Rock Bottom that will immediately fall apart if you don't tiptoe on them, and the bouncy leaves in Kelp Forest. So yeah, the platforming is much more enjoyable here. Not a big surprise. You know what's even less of a surprise? The fact that the combat is actually good now. Dutchman's combat is barely even combat. More like casually waving your jellyfish net in someone's ugly face until they disappear from this plane of reality. The combat here has seen a total overhaul across the board and is probably the thing with the furthest jump in quality between games. As I mentioned earlier, the cast of enemies offers some exceptional variety. Barring the literal fodder enemies along with some of the other early game robots like Hammer and Chompbot, most have their own unique strengths and weaknesses. A Sleepy Time will smoke you within seconds if you get within range, but can be approached by tiptoeing or by hitting them with a faraway projectile. Chucks will go down in one hit and have long gaps between attacks, but they're usually found around areas of bottomless pits, and their missiles are not only accurate, but possess some devilish knockback. I wouldn't call it the best collection of enemies in a 3D platformer ever. Mario Odyssey probably holds that distinction, but the Planktrons certainly stand out for more than just cosmetic differences, which is all I really needed. A great collection of robots is matched by everything else that makes fighting in these kinds of games fun. The greatly expanded movesets, the punchy sound effects, the way robots explode, and the snarky quips the trio will hand out as they're fighting all certainly help to add some flavor to the combat. Besides that, fighting is just a lot more important and is consistently rewarding. Robots are far more aggressive than any of the generic thugs and Flying Dutchman, and more golden spatulas are tied to completed combat sections, making it much harder to avoid confrontation. It's also worth mentioning that defeated robots will give you shiny objects, so it's very well incentivized. I especially like knocking robots into other robots. Not only just because it feels good to pull off, but the game will actually recognize your skill by rewarding you with extra shiny objects. Yeah, there's this weird combo text that will start appearing if you destroy 3 tikis or 2 robots in quick succession, and the better the combo, the longer and more ridiculous the combo name gets. At its best, you'll get the Super Ultra Mega Monster Combo.
Again!
Damn, those are pretty satisfying to get. Like a lot of other things in this game, the combo system wasn't necessary, and yet adds a bit more charm and fun to a game that's already so solid. Collecting is probably where this game made the least improvements, but it's also probably the only thing about Flying Dutchman that was handled pretty typically for the genre to begin with. The warp and to-do list systems already make backtracking and exploration about as convenient as it gets, and the fact that you've only got to keep track of 2 finite collectibles throughout the entire game is even better. Not to mention, you can collect any spatula or sock with any character, provided they can reach it in the first place. Golden spatulas are this game's equivalent to Power Stars or Jiggies, main collectibles that are used to access new stages and boss fights. Patrick's Lost Socks, of all things, remind me of Mario Sunshine's blue coins, and considering I'm one of the only people I know who likes blue coins, it's no shock that I love these too. These are simply a collectible that feed into another collectible and rewards those willing to look around and explore. Most are right out in the open, needing varying degrees of spatial awareness and skill to get, and the ones that don't typically require you to solve a simple puzzle or mess with something that's out of the ordinary. As you'd expect, there are a couple of socks that suck to get in repeat playthroughs. Socks found in the middle of goop puddles aren't difficult since you just have to get Patrick to throw some freezy fruit at it, but if there isn't a bus stop nearby, you'll have to go pretty far out of your way to find a place to switch with Patrick and then get back to the sock on foot, since the warp system will automatically switch you to the character meant for the spatula you're warping to, whether you want it or not. At its worst, it only takes about 5 minutes, but still, it's kind of annoying. The worst sock, however, is easily this one connected to the Sandman on Sand Mountain's Flounder Hill. You have to destroy 8 of these guys on the course, which does have its share of branching pathways, and needs about 2 to 3 run-throughs to get them all. And if you die, all the Sandmen respawn, and you gotta do that all over again. Still, the Lost Socks are a fun side quest without coming across as bloated and overdone. There's only 80 of them, so anyone who gets a stroke whenever they think about Mario Sunshine's 240 blue coins will probably find this a lot more manageable and fun. My only other gripe is that you can only trade 10 socks at a time, so if you hold off on talking to Patrick till you collect them all like I do, you'll just have to sit through the same conversation and golden spatula get animation 8 times in a row, which is just annoying. Shiny objects are the currency of the game. They're littered in every stage and can be found inside of both tikis and robots, and you can use them to pay your way into certain sub-areas, unlock bungees, and you can trade them in bulk to Mr. Krabs for another 8 golden spatulas. Unfortunately, while you do find plenty of shiny objects, the game does ask quite a lot from you, and this issue only gets worse the better and faster you get at the game. Now, I'm not a speedrunner by any means, but I did finish the playthrough I did for this video in just shy of 7 hours. In that time, I found enough shiny objects to pay for each bungee jump and to get into each sub-area that demanded it, but I only found enough money to pay for the first 3 golden spatulas from Krabs, because they get more and more expensive with each one you buy. I probably spent a good 30 minutes grinding for shiny objects in Sandy's Dream, and that's just not fun. And while I'm sticking close to the subject, one of my biggest issues with this game is its handling of the bungee jumping areas. With the exception of downtown, every Bungee's golden spatula or lost sock is just hanging out right there in the open, waiting for you to grab it. No obstacles, there's not a minigame involved, it's basically a glorified press aid for a spatula. And considering that Mr. Krabs already acts as a paywall for golden spatulas, we didn't need another group of spatulas doing what is essentially the same thing. How would I change this for the better? 2 ways. 1, make the bungee jumping challenges much more like the ones from the Spongebob movie game. Those challenges tasked you with destroying targets while avoiding timed obstacles and were much more engaging because of it. 2 is create a dedicated bungee button that you need to press in order to spawn in the hook. Think along the lines of Banjo-Kazooie's witch switches. This would further the motivation for players to explore, and regardless if you hide it before or after the bungee pit, it wouldn't be an inconvenience since you'll either run into it later in the level or quickly warp back to the bungee challenge so you can grab the spatula. Both options make for much more interesting challenges and simultaneously decrease the total number of shiny objects mandatory for completion. So now that most of the general gameplay stuff has been covered, we can quickly run through the levels and point out some good and some bad. Bikini Bottom is about as tightly designed as a hub world as it gets. It being a fantastic tutorial aside, it has just as much to collect here as in the actual levels, arguably even more since there are 3 hidden pairs of golden underwear that will permanently extend your health bar when you grab them. While its amount of content and compact nature are great from a gameplay perspective, it is somewhat jarring seeing all these locations and landmarks crammed together. The most notable issues being that the movie theater is right by the Krusty Krab and Chum Bucket, and that Sandy's Tree Dome is next door to Shady Shoals and the entrance to Rock Bottom. That being said, I'm a massive Spongebob nerd, so most people probably won't mind this. Jellyfish Fields performs very well as the first real level and teaches you just about everything you need to know that Bikini Bottom didn't teach you already, and introduces recurring stage elements at a quick yet organic pace. That said, the dedication to teaching through design, as well as the stage just being pretty easy, does make it a little boring to do on repeat playthroughs. Downtown Bikini Bottom is one of my favorite levels in the game because its boxy structure makes it one of the most open-ended levels in the game, and until the late game, the rooftops area is the most fun platforming section since it gives Sandy plenty of time to shine. Besides that, you've got a fairly hectic fighting gauntlet at the Lighthouse of SpongeBob, and the one time a bungee jumping challenge actually earned its right to be called a challenge at the Sea Needle, where you have to destroy all the tikis at each bungee pit, but also have to be careful not to hit any of the thunder tikis. My only gripe is that it is the first level that requires SpongeBob, and while the sections involving him are very forgiving, it's not what I would call pleasant. Goo Lagoon really deserves credit for stretching the location for as many creative sub-areas as possible instead of just opting to be a generic beach level. It does start you off at the beach, but then you go through a giant sandcastle, the seaside caverns, and end up at a carnival on the pier. However, I'm not too fond of this light reflection puzzle that takes some trial and error to get right, but if you want, you can cheese it by coming back once you've unlocked the cruise bubble and using it to destroy the hammer on the crates, which is almost always the method I use to get the spatula now. The Murmelair stands out for its greater focus on puzzle-based challenges. I'm quite personal to this disco floor gauntlet, the throw fruit courses, and yes, even the rolling ball course, which wasn't nearly as bad as I remembered. My main issue is that this is the stage that focuses on your newfound Bubbable move and tries to utilize as much as possible by having these switches embedded into surfaces that can only be hit by it. It's not too bad when it's just right there in the open, but trying to line up a shot while on a rotating platform with obstacles trying to get in the way can get pretty finicky and took a few many attempts to get right. Rock Bottom is solid all throughout, with its highlight being the museum. It's full of good platforming and is chock full of visual references passing themselves off as artwork, but what's really cool is that you can complete the section as either SpongeBob or Sandy, which is unique for this game. Really, the worst thing I can say about this is that there's this moment where you have to cross a suspended narrow bridge in 5 seconds as SpongeBob. I mean, It's dumb and stressful, and it's kind of really annoying if you mess it up, but it's so short that it's barely worth getting mad about. Sand Mountain's another one of my favorite levels. Barring that one really irritating lost sock I mentioned earlier, this is an excellent level that really showcases how good the sliding feels. There are 3 exhilarating tracks with fairly challenging time trials, plenty of alternate pathways and secrets, and are each punctuated with an enemy gauntlet. It's always a blast when I get to this place. SpongeBob's Dream is my favorite level in the game. It already stands out for the surreal visuals, but what really makes this place great are Sandy, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs' dreams, which offer up the hardest challenges for sliding, platforming, and fighting respectively. It really is a much needed kick up the backside. And of course, who could forget Patrick's dream?
Very well. Your challenge is to find the golden spatula!
You're holding it.
You did it! Now here is your reward.
Yep, I really earned this one. I will say I don't like this mission with the beach ball, as the physics feel kind of janky and it's a bit too much effort to start over, but still amazing stage overall. Talk to anyone who's ever played this what the low point is, and they'll always say Kelp Forest, and really, I'm no different. It's really complex since Sour's a first playthrough, but will become increasingly more manageable and, dare I say, enjoyable with each passing playthrough. The biggest issue Kelp Forest has is that it's simply way too dark and everything looks way too similar, which already makes the level fairly confusing. But then you've got to find 6 lost campers for Mrs. Puff, carry 3 stone tikis to the central area without dying to progress into the caves, constantly backtrack within the caves to switch between SpongeBob and Patrick to both find all the power crystals for Barnacle Boy and get to the exit, and then we end with this travesty, which is easily the worst part of the whole game in my opinion. A hellish sliding section with super narrow vines, razor sharp turns, and almost no margin for error. Simply getting to the end of this thing is an achievement of itself, but that's not even counting the time trial where you have to do this god-awful course on a fairly strict time limit in one perfect run. With all that said, I do get some enjoyment out of both the Tiki Roundup and Kelp Cave area, because they're still some of the only parts of the game that I haven't completely figured out and consistently tease my brain. That, and there's some of the best instances of Patrick's potential of puzzle solving. Moving on is the Flying Dutchman's Graveyard, and it's another one of my favorite levels. It offers some of the best moments of the game with a gauntlet of wall jumping courses that progressively get harder as you move along, a really cool pirate ship battle with the robots, and caps it off with a mini boss fight with the Dirty Ghost himself. That being said, this location houses one of the most obscure things in the whole game. For the longest time, there were 2 golden spatulas in the first sub-area that I couldn't figure out how to get because they were submerged in the goo. Turns out, by hitting this hatch door with a cruise bubble, it will close up and the goo level will lower significantly, allowing you to grab the spatulas. Considering that there's nothing else in the game like this, I personally feel this is kind of bullshit, since nothing really hints that you can do this in the level, with remarkably unhelpful challenge names like Goo Tanker Ahoy and A Path Through the Goo. Overall, these levels are a genuinely good time and aren't afraid to step up the difficulty as the game goes on. There's only one bad level out of the bunch, and that's much more than I can say for most other 3D platformers. You know, it's still very hard for me to realize that Flying Dutchman only had one boss, considering it had worse issues plaguing it, but one look at Battle's collection of bosses makes that fact very apparent. Battle for Bikini Bottom has 6 boss fights, 3 mini-bosses that can be found at the end of a given stage, and the 3 main area boss fights. The mini-bosses aren't amazing by any means, they only take 3 hits to beat and have pretty simplistic attack patterns, but they're still good enough and do get noticeably more aggressive with each hit point lost. It also helps that they're tacked on the end of their respective stages, making them feel much more like a pleasant surprise to end a level on. Of these, the Flying Dutchman is the best of the bunch, and yes, it's pretty ironic how the Flying Dutchman demoted to mid-boss was much more challenging than the Flying Dutchman as a final boss in his own game. By contrast, the 3 Titan champions of the Robotic Rebellion are all undeniable highlights for this game. Each mixes simpler attacks with some surprisingly tricky attacks, sufficiently test your abilities, and successfully up the tension through their sheer scope and atmosphere. Be it the Poseidon Championship matchup with Robot Sandy, chilling suspense and awkwardness provided by Robot Patrick's assault in the Industrial Park, and of course, the final boss. Battle for Bikini Bottom is exceptionally generous with the minimum requirements, only requiring 75 golden spatulas to get into the Chum Bucket Lab, meaning you can skip Kelp Forest, the trading side quest with Mr. Krabs and Patrick, or some of the game's other less desirable spatulas and can still square off against the final boss. Arguably the best part of the whole game. SpongeBob and his buddies walk in to see a massive robot built in SpongeBob's likeness, and catch Plankton trying to fiddle with the original Duplicatotron so that the robots will follow his command again. It's too late for that though, as the real mastermind of the operation reveals himself as Plankton's own robotic double who has a firm hold on the Planktons. With no other options, SpongeBob prepares himself for the final battle. Much like the previous area bosses, it's a 2v1, but this time you're on your own. No tag outs and no backup. Now you get to feel how it's like to be teamed up on. Spongebob Steel Pans is the main opponent, attacking fiercely with horizontal and vertical karate chops along with a weaponized version of SpongeBob's own battle cry. As you take out the power points located all over SpongeBob's body, Robot Plankton will use his laser-mounted hovercraft to take potshots at you. I would have been perfectly content with just this, but then we got the Phase 2. Robot Plankton goes inside the SpongeBob to repair him from the inside, and SpongeBob follows him to finish the job. The fight itself is less like a fight and more of a long section that mixes combat and platforming. You need to destroy these vital fuses to win, and every step of the way, Planktons will be hassling you, and Robot Plankton will not be giving you any room to breathe. Finish off the Robot Brain, and SpongeBob Steel Pans is out of commission. Robot Plankton becomes too preoccupied bitching at himself to continue his reign of terror, and SpongeBob vows to continue the fight until Bikini Bottom is completely safe. That is, unless you already got 100%, where you get your reward. A cute little in-game cutscene of all the NPCs singing the SpongeBob SquarePants theme while SpongeBob himself dances along and just has the best time imaginable. It's admittedly not much for a 100% reward, but Battle was a game that was so intrinsically fun to play that I don't really need a worthwhile reward to feel satisfied. And yeah, that about covers my thoughts on Battle for Bikini Bottom. It offers so much for a game that could have gotten away with so little. It's got a goofy, simple story that offers plenty of funny lines and character interactions, visuals that have held up very well thanks to SpongeBob's timeless visual style, a soundtrack that's exceptionally well composed on top of being right on the money with how SpongeBob music should sound, the absolute majority of the original voice cast who perform as well as they do in the show, and gameplay that, while not necessarily innovative, managed to simultaneously fit well with the SpongeBob universe and be a fun game in its own right. That last part is really why I'd call Battle for Bikini Bottom one of the best licensed games out there. Strip everything away SpongeBob related and you'd still have a more polished version of the Collectathon platformers that the N64 nearly had down to a science, like Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie. But because of how tightly knit these SpongeBob elements are to the gameplay mechanics, you simply can't have one without the other. Battle for Bikini Bottom couldn't have existed without SpongeBob, the same way that Batman Arkham couldn't have existed without Batman, and Kingdom Hearts couldn't exist without Disney. It's almost like a symbiotic relationship, and that's pretty special for a type of game that's usually so easy to make fun of. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Kelp Forest, along with a few faulty and underdeveloped mechanics like the bungee jumping and SpongeBob, hold it back in my eyes, but that's why I'm so excited for tomorrow. Yes, like every other fan of Battle for Bikini Bottom, I lost my mind when I saw that THQ Nordic got the rights back for SpongeBob and announced Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated. And it looks so vibrant and so good that I'm already pretty much sold on it. And I have a pretty good feeling that THQ might change some of this lesser stuff for the better. We already heard how they're planning on adding Robot Squidward, who got cut during the original's development, and who's to say they won't make Kelp Forest less of a pain in the ass, or make the bungee challenges harder, or maybe some other crazy unexpected feature that flips the game on its head in the best way possible. I honestly don't know, but I am hopeful it gets the same quality treatment that the likes of the Reignited trilogy and the Insane trilogy got. And with that, that's the best SpongeBob game done and over with. Technically, that means we're only going downhill from here, but I'm nonetheless eager for what's up next. That being the SpongeBob SquarePants movie game. This has been Baileography, and I wish you all my very best.